Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. I'm Carmela Fonbuena of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. It's nice to see friends and colleagues here in the Zoom room. Can you hear me? Yes, it's nice to see friends and colleagues here in the Zoom room. Okay. Magandang umaga po. I'm Carmela Fonbuena of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. It's nice to see friends and colleagues here po in the Zoom room. We have journalism and communication students also joining us. Good morning to our viewers on Facebook. We are being live streamed on the Facebook pages of PCIJ and other partner organizations. Today is World Press Freedom Day. We celebrate the courage of Filipino journalists amidst all the challenges our profession has been facing. We celebrate Filipino journalists who continue to dedicate their reporting to the truth, to democracy, to human rights. We celebrate this solidarity among journalists today. We need to be a united front against attacks on the media. There's not much else to celebrate, unfortunately. As you will hear from our speakers today, journalism is under siege. We were not so surprised anymore when the Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index 2021 was released last month, and the Philippines dropped in the ranking again, 138 out of 180 nations. The report cited the continued attacks of President Rodrigo Duterte and his administration on the media, particularly its attacks on Rappler and its CEO Maria Ressa, and the shutdown of ABS-CBN. The report also cited the online harassment and red tagging of journalists, cyber attacks on news websites, among other forms of attacks and hostility against the media. PCIJ itself po was the target of spear phishing attacks recently. Different email addresses post as PCIJ editorial to get people to download suspicious attachments. Please check that we only use our pcij.org emails for our official communications. Miss Melinda Quintos de Jesus, ma'am, of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, CMFR, is our main speaker today. Ms. Melinda will present a report on the state of media freedom in the Philippines. Ms. Melinda was among the women journalists who wrote critically of the Marcos regime as a columnist in the Bulletin Today. In 1983, she, along with other critical women writers, was eased out of her post as columnist and moved to become deputy editor and columnist before she became editor-in-chief of the news magazine Veritas News Weekly. This is one of the forefronts of the alternative press. And in 1989, Ma'am Melinda organized CMFR. The State of Media Freedom in the Philippines is a regular production of the Freedom for Media, Freedom for All Network, or FMFA. This network is composed of CMFR, PCIJ, the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, the Philippine Press Institute, and Minda News. Jonathan De Santos of the NUJP will follow Ms. Melinda's presentation to focus on the cases of several Filipino journalists that we need to pay more attention to. So that's the first part of our program, which is organized by FMFA. The second part, where we'll have Mr. Atom Orolio take over as moderator, is organized by the Wag Kukurap Coalition. This is composed of about 400 Filipino journalists who signed in July last year a media pledge that recognized our role in this year's elections as another critical moment for our country. So democracy, we know, will be on the ballot on May 9. We are less than a week away. The signatories of the media pledge committed to provide accurate, reliable, and essential information that will empower voters and encourage public discussion and debate. It has not always been easy for Filipino journalists to do our jobs. However, we have been confronted with various challenges during the campaign. We saw the banning of reporters in campaign events, refusal by candidates to attend media-hosted debates, a spate of DDoS attacks on news websites, and online hostility against news organizations and reporters in relation to their coverage of the candidates. So we will hear about these from our speakers. We're also happy to have cartoonist Zach, or cartoonista Zach. He's here with us. He will do a live art based on our discussions today. Cartoonista Zach is known for his lampoons on the state of social justice and human rights in the Philippines. He's a co-founder of Pitik Bulag, an organization currently in partnership with Facts First PH. It is committed to making comics and cartoons to help combat disinformation online. Okay, so cartoonista Zach will be presenting his art before we close the program. Stay for that because that will be
recording in progress.
Amazing. So there's a lot we will discuss today. So let me now turn over the microphone to Ms. Melinda Quintas de Jesus for the State of Media Freedom Report. Good morning, everyone.
And good morning, everyone. My assignment today has become an annual ritual for CMFR and the Freedom for Media, Freedom for All Network, or FMFA. As the pandemic has forced us to hold the observance of World Press Freedom Day as a digital program, it has, despite a most unhappy cause, connected us to a wider audience. What used to be held in a restaurant venue with maybe 50 people, we now can reach you where you are, all around the country and even abroad. So thank you for being here and joining us on this milestone, a day when the world pauses to assess the state of press freedom in different countries in the world and to examine the environment of the exercise of this basic human right all around the world. While CMFR has been part of other global and regional celebrations of World Press Freedom Day in the past, this assignment at home is closest to my heart, seemingly more significant in the exercise as a chance to interact with other organizations like CMFR, sharing the work that we do from day to day, and finally presenting our findings to others who hopefully are just as concerned about the risks and threats confronting journalists who are doing their work. This program has been made possible because the different members of FMFA focus on different aspects of press freedom protection and media development. Joining forces, we are able to share and build on one another's efforts, strengthening the collective impact of otherwise standalone activities. Most of the FMFA organizations had worked together under the banner of Freedom Fund for Filipino Journalists Incorporated, or FFFJ, which was organized in the early 2000s to respond to the killings of journalists around the country. FFFJ addressed and to work against the scandal or to understand the scandal of being counted among the most dangerous assignments in the world, even as Filipinos claim to have a most vibrant and vigorous democracy, with a constitution that enshrined press freedom in the same words almost as the First Amendment is worded in the US Constitution. FFFJ included quick response teams, and I remember our late Jose Pavia, who would lead these teams into the different places where a journalist was killed and even supported cases in court, including cases filed by 17 surviving families of the victims of the Ampatuan massacre. Sadly, with the other parts of the world also afflicted by such attacks and threats and worse, the funding for all our efforts began to wane, and we could no longer maintain the continuing costs of all these activities. This new coalition is less ambitious, coming together to undertake advocacy and campaigns to protect press freedom in the country. It may be good to recall that FMFA was a spontaneous response to unprecedented attacks initiated by government against news organizations and journalists soon after the inauguration of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte in 2016. In his State of the Nation address in 2017, Duterte publicly denounced 3 news organizations for various charges which effectively delivered a clear message to all media, even those who were not included in his attack. Members of FMFA called on other NGOs, even those who were not engaged directly in media, so we could map out a series of actions to call public attention to a kind of presidential action which had not been seen since the days of martial law. The 5 members with the PCIJ as Administrative Secretariat include CMFR, Mindanews, NUJP, PPPI. Working now with a much smaller funding source, we are engaged in watching and monitoring trends, attacks, and threats, issuing statements, initiating or joining campaigns, writing letters of protest, holding forums that will clarify the message or the position of the community, disseminating statements and findings so others can partake of this shared knowledge. The lesson from FFFJ and from challenges faced by FMFA is clear. We need to work together or we fall together. Our aim then, in this morning's program, is to engage a wider community of civil society, of citizens, of schools, of faculty, some of whom have joined FMFA in signing of statements, including a letter to UNESCO in September 2020 to protest the classification of the Ampatuan trial as resolved. UNESCO received the complaint, examined our protest, and decided that with the appeal of the decision going to the higher courts, the resolution indeed was not a reality and reclassified the case as still ongoing. We all believe that an attack against one is an attack on all, and the failure to respond or to resist, perhaps to counter pressures from public officials, weakens not only the besieged journalists or news organization, but the entire press community and the institution itself. On another level, we believe that media freedom is not for journalists to enjoy as their professional privilege or benefit. Media freedom has no meaning unless its exercise benefits the entire society, with every citizen believing in the work of the press as necessary to their well-being and to their empowerment. Citizens must feel that journalists provide a service that helps him or her to know and understand what is happening from day to day, to have and form an opinion or to take a stand about issues that are being talked about, receiving information that enables individual to act as a citizen, which means that that individual shares with others the benefits as well as the obligations and responsibilities of the entire community. A series of Black Friday rallies, a campaign to wear black on Fridays, the efforts, unfortunately, soon showed a failure of spirit on our part. State powers moved intently and intensively, growing in its attacks. The same way the administration had moved as it did against other critics, enough to damage institutions, the mechanisms installed for check and balance of the powers of the state. Recall the attack against Senator Laila de Lima, a sitting senator in a separate co-equal branch of government who, until today, remains in jail. And the ouster of an even more restrained critic, Philippine Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Lourdes Sereno, who headed a separate co-equal judiciary. This being the last World Press Freedom Day program under Duterte's administration, it makes sense to do a brief review of the 6 years of the man's term of office as it affected media freedom and the press. In the early years of the Duterte administration, CMFR's joint report with FMFA described the radical changes in the relationship of the president with the press. After a hostile confrontation with a journalist in one of his earliest briefings as a president-elect, when Duterte used an offensive language to cut down a reporter's inquiry into his health, Duterte simply stopped talking to the press, except to threaten and to scold media critics. If every now and then he would say something like, "Oh, they are free to criticize, this is their right," or words to that effect, But having done what he had done and having said what he had said, these claims no longer had credibility. He probably has the record among presidents of being the least interactive with the media, leaving the Presidential Communications Operations Office to keep up the daily briefings, to issue announcements as necessary, and that was about it. Let us also recall that from the very beginning, the inaugural ceremonies were kept out of public sight. What used to be held in the open field of the Luneta Grandstand was now a closed program, leaving reporters of private media organizations to fill the air with trivia outside the palace grounds, as only the government media with their controlled coverage were allowed to enter the hall. It was an insult to the press, it was an insult to the people of the country, but no one dared to complain. Perhaps the best way to describe the interaction between Duterte's administration and the press is its relegation to propaganda work, undertaken by troll armies operating mostly on social media. Duterte's hostility to Rappler deepened with coverage that included critical analysis of the government's war on drugs. Early on, the palace ordered a ban on Rappler's reporter, Pia Ranada, who was barred from attending events when the president himself would be present. I recall in 2017, May 23, report Duterte's hostility toward the critical press as a virus that has contaminated all organs of government, and yet the press has continued to report on government, and more often than not, leaving out other sources who could contribute to a wider perspective in the coverage. This has a lot to do, I think, with the way certain narratives have taken hold in the public mind. Given that the public forum seems limited only to the central messages that the government wants the public to hear, Duterte did not have to declare martial law to get his news out, to get his words recorded and repeated in various media platforms, and become the soundtrack of the last 6 years. The following graphs provide a quick view of how much has changed and how much has remained the same. The Duterte administration has not changed the constitution of the country, which protects freedom of expression and press freedom, but it has reset the limits on what state agents can do with impunity, allowing the kind of latitude to the exercise of state power when these target so-called enemies of the state, including media organizations and individual members. 23 journalists were killed in the line of work under the Duterte administration. The victims include 1 woman and 22 men. 15 were from radio, 6 from print, and 2 from online. Killings remain a focus of international watchdog organizations, but CMFR sees these attacks as part of the endemic violence that afflicts entire society and therefore threatens all other citizens. The numbers themselves are a sign of a deeper societal fault line, the resort to the use of a gun to resolve a problem. Journalists are moving targets of these violent forces because they exercise power of their own. We should observe then that Duterte's use of violence in language, including his formal presidential speeches, must have made it easier for some of these killings to occur. But the number of other kinds of threats has definitely increased during this administration. Recall our description of hostility against the press as a virus. The virus was activated, morphed into its all kinds of variants in the last 6 years. There were 258 cases of attacks and threats from June 30, 2016 to April 30, 2016. To April 30. There was an increase in DDoS attacks, and these were new given the technological advances available to those who wanted to attack the press. An increase during the 6-month period from November 30, 2021 to April 30, 2021. 11 attacks were recorded on several news websites, including The Inquirer, philstark.com, Rappler, Verifiles, and alternative media sites such as Alter Media and Pinoy Weekly. The Cagayan de Oro-based news site Gold Star Daily also became a subject of a website attack. However, a favorite weapon, libel for political purposes, remained for regular use. Let me highlight that the high number of libel cases filed against journalists, with 56 charged during this period. The bulk of this number were the 21 journalists included in several libel case charges filed by Energy Secretary Alfonso Cusi and businessman Dennis Uy on November 29, 2021 for their reportage on the allegedly questionable deal in the Malampaya Deepwater to Gas project. Intimidation cases, which include red tagging, were also high and may be probably more unique to this administration system of attacking the press. We are now in the period of election, and we all know that elections are a period of violence, and therefore a season for more attacks and threats. There are several already recorded election-related attacks which were reported during this period. Two of Ferdinand, let me describe one closely because of how it was done. Two of Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s campaign staffers prevented Rappler reporter Lian Buan from interviewing Marcos Jr. at a campaign rally in Quezon City on April 23, 2022. Buan was attempting to interview the former senator when a security officer shoved the reporter. One of Marcos Media's officers also pushed aside Buan's smartphone camera. Solicitor General, the shoving and the pushing, these should never happen. The other attack is also peculiar because the Solicitor General does not usually get involved in these things, but given that this is Jose Calida, he threatened legal action to nullify Rappler's partnership with the Commission on Elections ahead of 2022 polls. Partnerships, agreements, which have been regular practice between COMELEC and different media organizations. He claimed that the partnership would give Rappler power to determine false information without any delineated, in quotes, guidelines. And then he added, smearing the news organizations for its allegations about its history of disseminating unverified and false claims. Recently, Rappler correspondents were initially barred from covering in Ilocos Sur the Uniteam rally on April 17, 2022. They were allowed to cover after they secured endorsement letters from their editors in Manila. Just added harassment. And in Bukidnon, think about the virus moving at the lower ground. Melino Burro of the Mulog town ordered the seizure of the transmitter and other equipment of a radio station that featured critical commentary about him. Burro was a re-electionist candidate, while the owner of the radio station was running as councillor as an independent candidate in the same town. Philippine politics on the ground. The point for the media, please, the principle of press freedom protection prevents any kind of closure of operations. And this applies, of course, to the case of ABS-CBN. Whatever failures in terms of following ordinances, laws, regulations, there are agencies that take care of this, there are penalties for this, but it should not result in the closure of a media organization, as that goes directly against the Constitution's protection. Quote, citing the late Father Joaquin Bernas. But we must look at perpetrators. And this is a trend that started in some previous administrations, but very much fewer than what we have seen today. This is a trend that ends the 6 years of Duterte's continued increased involvement of the state agents as perpetrators in attacks and threats. There would be more, I think, if the media were more aggressive or assertive about their rights, because we have always felt that perpetrators work with state agents in many cases, because these could assure the confidentiality of their involvement. The unidentified attackers may also be acting under directions of state agents or offices, just as the vigilantes have said, described their role in the drug war. They were ordered by police to do raids, to do abductions, and to kill drug suspects. In the last 6 years, given the presidential virus, law enforcement agents seemed more open about how they could threaten, instill fear in members of the press for so long as they could project them as enemies or supporters of the enemies of the state. In conclusion, CMFR's quantitative content analysis, which we have posted every 2 weeks during the period of the campaign, has been limited to TV coverage because it is and has remained one of the leading sources of political information. CMFR reviews and analyzes primetime news programs of 4 broadcast stations. And we have found that despite the pledge of Wag Kukurap to become more vote-centric in coverage, the majority of the reports, 779 from February 28 to April 17 this year, were on campaign sorties. Unfortunately, viewing some of these, one sometimes questioned the role of the reporter, as they seemed to share the very excitement that they said they were seeing on stage or in the rallies they observed. Some of these were at length, more than the usual amount of time given to most stories, as they followed, for example, Mayor Escos Moreno's slow crawl of the Manila streets, capturing the masses masses who stood up, of course, to greet their mayor on the streets. More examples of this kind of coverage actually suggests the failure of our efforts to report the campaign with more attention to voters rather than the candidates, with agendas that are set by the news departments and not by campaign camps, at least in reporting the candidates. These should be initiated as independent examination of the worthiness of the candidates. Print, already weakened by the loss of their market, has not tried to shift more in-depth reports and has kept up with a futile attempt to be as current with events. Rather than providing alternative perspectives, the view from the voters, close-up scrutiny that journalists should subject those seeking power. There have been few and far between analysis of the capacity demonstrated by the principal candidates, the kind of examination of character and of integrity that could help voters make wiser decisions. Reports resort always to quoting different sources, an effort at what I think is false objectivity. Journalists seems to be restraining themselves from interpreting the news and the meaning that these news hold, and getting to start a public discourse that has to do more with more substantive questions and issues than who, what, when, and where. So media have taken the path of least resistance, simply recording, satisfied with stenography journalism, refusing to let the facts tell the story. Easier always to quote a source than to ascertain incontestable facts. Most senior journalists have shared their view that the character of a candidate's rallies have become so phenomenal, something that they had never seen in their long careers as journalists. And yet, if you look at the mainstream, there has been very restrained coverage of these rallies. These are observable. These are something journalists can attend, and they can draw all kinds of stories and draw out meaning in what is happening in these rallies. They have become more comfortable, and there has been wider coverage of the surveys and the results of the surveys, although these methods are practically invisible to most journalists who report them. Why? Because we simply get the results with a few explanations here and there, much of which hardly ever get into the coverage. Indeed, one would have to turn to social media to get the stories of what is happening around us. And this is sad because we started out the 6 years saying we should preserve mainstream press because this is where verified stories come out of. So let us try to understand how the press has seen the different developments that grow before their eyes. I think it is a story more about voters. And is this the reason for the seeming lack of interest of the mainstream press? I leave you with this disturbing thought, as all the other graphs leave you with disturbing numbers and images. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Okay, it looks like I'm next. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. Since October 2021, when aspirants filed their certificates of candidacy, at least 3 journalists have been killed. Audrey Estrada, a broadcaster in Lanao del Norte, was found dead in her house in March with 15 stab wounds. In December, Pampanga-based journalist Jesus Jess Malabanan was shot by unidentified assailants inside their house, inside their store, in Calbayog City, Samar. In October, broadcaster Orlando Don Dinoy was also shot and killed inside his rented apartment in Bansalan, Davao del Sur. As we mark these killings, we remember as well the killing of Doc Jerry Ortega in 2011 and the slow progress in the case. 11 years later, the accused mastermind in his murder is free and retains influence and power in Palawan, while the family has little recourse but to put their trust in the justice system. Press freedom and human rights groups have long held that impunity in attacks against journalists emboldens those who seek to silence the critical press and put the entire media community at risk. Since June 2016, there have been at least 20 journalists killed. We say at least because there is sometimes some dispute whether the killings are work-related or not. We, of course, welcome moves by the police as well as by the Presidential Task Force on Media Security to investigate and seek accountability for the killings of our colleagues. But sometimes the debate seems to go into whether it was work-related or whether the victim was actually a journalist. While proper sorting of data is important, there is sometimes an impression that this is also done to counter criticism of the media situation in the Philippines. In the case of a reported shooting attempt on Daily Tribune correspondent Aldwin Quitasol in Baguio City, the task force seemed more intent on playing down the threat and even theorized that what he thought was a gunshot was actually a motorcycle backfiring. Although Quitasol was given the benefit of the doubt that someone actually tried to shoot him, The task force also warned against believing supposed Marites gossip about the reported attack. All of this while the police investigation was still ongoing. Statements like these suggest that the risks that journalists face are being defined and categorized away. Actions and statements that tend to minimize or play down attacks and threats against journalists make these attacks more likely and also make it more difficult for colleagues to report when they are victims. As we are concerned with how the authorities categorize journalists and non-journalists, the media community must also reconsider how we look at bloggers, and social media commenters. Take the shooting of Jana Villegas, who was described in news reports as a controversial Facebook commentator on April 15. She was described as neither an employee of any media outfit nor a member of any legitimate press group in the province and elsewhere in central Mindanao. I personally am not familiar with her work, but with the job losses, the loss of ABS-CBN's franchise, and the economic effects of the pandemic, many of our colleagues have had to switch platforms and to do the reporting on, for example, Facebook. More than platforms, especially with many of our colleagues also going into TikTok and YouTube, we should also look into principles and ethics when we gatekeep our community. In January, hired goons harassed and shot at colleagues from Umani Productions while they were interviewing farmers involved in a land dispute in San Jose del Monte, Bulacan. According to reports, the goons punched videographer Manuel Garciliano and took his camera, audio recorder, and other coverage equipment. The Umani journalists and the farmers and paralegals working with the community were reportedly made to lie face down on the ground as guards shot at their feet. Although a blotter report has been filed with police over the incident, it is unclear if any progress has been made on the case. What is clear, though, is that these are the stories behind the stories, and that covering stories on the ground, especially on land disputes or when covering farmers' rights, comes with risks as well. And yeah. But aside from the physical risks, libel and cyber libel is still being used to intimidate and silence the media. Perhaps to illustrate that point, on April 23, Commission on Elections Commissioner Ray Bulay said in response to some groups casting doubt on the poll body that the COMELEC would not hesitate to call upon the armed forces of the Philippines, which is now under COMELEC control, to round you up and have you jailed. At that same press briefing, he also said that he will not think twice about filing cases against those who sow discord. Now, we all want the May elections to be clean, honest, and orderly, as much as Bulay, if not more, because we are just citizens who do not have the security that government officials have. We want the elections to go well and for the results of the polls to reflect the will of the people. But the COMELEC is not immune from criticism, and doubts over the elections are common, especially with the campaign season as tense as it has been. In response to backlash to his comments, Bulay clarified that, basically said, familiar kayo sa libel, media kayo, di ba? And he said that the stories that reported the threat or reported that he was threatening groups was essentially libelous. News subjects are, of course, free to clarify their statements and explain what they meant. And they can do that without hinting at filing cases against journalists. That was not what happened in December when Energy Secretary Alfonso Cusi and Dennis Uy, the third donor, filed libel and cyber libel complaints across 7 news organizations. And these are clear harassment suits meant to intimidate and chill the press. In his demands, in his complaint, Cusi is demanding 200 million pesos in damages from each of the 7 news organizations. And this is an amount that could cripple news organizations if enforced. And even if it isn't, the lawyers' fees that these newsrooms will have to pay to answer the complaints and the time it would take to address them would mean time that will not be spent on reporting, and time that will be that loss of time will also mean less information for the public. The subjects of the libel complaints are stories published on a graft suit filed against Cusi and Uy, And the stories were based on a press conference, a press release, and a complaint filed before the Office of the Ombudsman. All of these are fair game in journalism, especially when it is about a public official involving a government project. No? For Secretary QC to say in his complaint that the journalist accused him of graft was a total misunderstanding, if not a deliberate attempt to mislead the public on the role of journalists. Although we now have a National Press Freedom Day, by law that is on August 30th of each year, we wait for the decriminalization of libel, which has remained a threat to press freedom and to the actual freedom of our colleagues facing complaints. The continued red tagging of journalists on social media and in government statements has also increased the risk that our colleagues face since online attacks can easily and have at times spilled over to physical ones. Rappler's Lian Buan, was mentioned earlier, was the most recently red tagged with an anonymous Twitter user calling her a high-ranking official of the Communist Party of the Philippines simply because she is a director of the NUJP. It was one of the sillier claims, but one that we still have to take seriously because, for example, among our colleagues who have been red tagged, Frenchime Cumpio is still detained 2 years after her arrest. Cumpio was editor of Eastern Vista, a news website, when she was arrested and charged for illegal possession of firearms in Tacloban City in February 2020. She is now also facing a non-bailable case of terrorist financing under the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act over money that was supposedly found during the arrest. According to the Altermedia Network, which has been constantly calling for her release, the accusation against her is based entirely on the statements of two questionable witnesses whom the government presented as rebel attorneys. Meanwhile, the websites of at least 3 news outfits, Mindanao Gold Star Daily, Press 1 PH, and Interaction in Manila, went down in March because of distributed denial of service attacks. And these DDoS attacks have been increasing since last year. Although we are NUJP and the alternative media websites are not strangers to DDoS attacks, this has spread to mainstream media. And although there have been unified statements against it, we feel that there are more newsrooms that have chosen to keep quiet about it and suffer in silence. No, which we feel as well is a misstep. We have to acknowledge when we are attacked and work together to call these out and to call for accountability for these attacks. The Philippines marks World Press Freedom Day at another crossroads in our nation's story. And with the local and national elections less than a week away, we have seen the election season, as these always are, as tense and emotional, and many have been brought to the breaking point by the stress and at times hostility of being on the campaign trail. In light of all this, the persistent attempts to discredit the press and the work we do, and the threats and harassment that often follow critical reporting, it is easy to fall into the trap of hopelessness, or worse, resentment at our community and the public whose right to know we serve. But it would help to remember that we have not weathered the threats and attacks alone. We have learned to support and stand for each other in big ways and in small gestures, and are closer now to the spirit of collaboration and solidarity that is our best hope in what have been dark days for the press in the Philippines and in the region. We have formed coalitions, initially for fact-checking and against disinformation, and alliances that have also led to mutual aid and support. And these engagements have not been confined to the media community. Increasingly, we have found ourselves alongside lawyers, rights defenders, members of the academe, and of civil society to, for example, question the Anti-Terrorism Act and the far-reaching effects we fear it will have on our fundamental freedoms. And throughout all these, whether on social media or at quiet candlelighting ceremonies or at loud protests, we have also had the support of the communities that we report about and that we report for. As members of the media community noted in a pledge that hundreds of us signed last July, every election is a reckoning for democracy. The elections next week are an opportunity to elect leaders who will push for more spaces for discourse and dissent, more access to government information, more transparency, and a healthy relationship with the media as a check on power. But we mark World Press Freedom Day also with the determination that the community of independent journalists will not rise or fall on the outcome of the May elections, and that the work we do will continue whoever is in power. As much as it has been true in the past 6 years, we recognize that the best way forward in difficult times is together, and that our best source of support is each other and the people we report for. Uh, Thank you very much. Happy World Press Freedom Day and good morning to everyone.
Thank you, Ma'am Melinda. Thank you, Jonathan. Before we proceed to the second set of speakers, there's a question here for our two first speakers from Mr. Ray Gaspay. Are our human rights defenders working against oppression well supported by media? How close is the collaboration between the human rights defenders and the free press? This is very important and may help in fighting against corruption and oppression. Would you like to take this question, ma'am?
I will take the question and Jonathan can add as well. I actually think there should be much more collaboration on the issues that the human rights defenders deal with, because they are directly and also have established their track records for understanding how these cases are. If you will notice, the media will report attacks and threats without noting that these are human rights violations, because they feel that that adds on something that it isn't in the blotter. They report it as ordinary crime. And as ordinary crime gets classified not within the context of human rights violations. And we would like to be able to promote this greater context, that if it is a journalist or a human rights defender or human rights worker, that we are able always in the media to include that and incorporate that particular context, because that is how people learn about theoretical things. That is how people learn about principles. When you see its actual experience of its attack or threat against it. So indeed, some of our efforts need to reach out to the human rights sector, the experts that are there, their stories, and we should see exactly how those stories are sometimes missed by the media because they are simply not as important as all the other stories about politicians, etc., and prominent people. So I will stop there. There's a whole lot more to be said about this. What we do need to bear in mind is that both media and human rights defenders are often the object of attacks and threats.
Jonathan, you want to add?
Thank you.
That?
No, I feel that media and human rights workers, human rights defenders are in a way natural allies. And we have seen this happen during in stories on the drug war and recently on red tagging, for example, and in cases directly affecting media, for like libel. No? But I agree that a lot of stories can also be reported in with the lens of human rights. Human rights is, of course, the killings, of course, fall under human rights, and other abuses fall under human rights. But for example, housing is also a right, and that's so the human rights lens would be useful in issues like that. No? So we do need to expand it more. But in terms of collaboration and interaction, there is a lot of we do talk a lot. There is a lot of collaboration between the two sectors. Naman.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Jonathan. We have more time for questions later. We entertained a few because we had a bit of time. Before I turn over to Mr. Atom Arroyo, we would like to play the media pledge that journalists signed last year. After that, we will have speeches from our journalists. They will tell us about their personal experiences. Pearl, can we play the pledge?
A re-election is a reckoning for democracy. As journalists reporting on another critical moment for our country, we have a duty to provide accurate, reliable, and essential information that will empower voters and encourage public discussion and debate.
Affirming that election integrity is not just about credible counting of votes, but about clean, level, legal, transparent, and accountable campaigning. Credible elections need credible media. Conversely, corrupted media can further corrupt politics. Citizens need issues and debates to be clarified, not simply amplified.
We pledge to put voters and the integrity of the electoral process at the center of our reporting. Focus on issues, not just on personalities. Examine the track record and qualifications of candidates and political parties vying for public office, and hold them accountable for the veracity and honesty of their every statement and promise.
Cover as responsible and accountable the institutions mandated to ensure an even, orderly, and credible electoral playing field. Stand in solidarity with each other when any journalist or news organization is harassed by state agents, political parties, candidates, or private groups for their evidence-based journalism. Be accountable to the public. We will hold each other to higher standards of impartiality, credibility, and integrity.
In line with these principles, we commit to challenge and correct statements and claims that have no basis in fact, avoid highlighting or amplifying falsehood, hate speech, and incitements to violence.
Report on the partisan activities of government officials, including those working for national and local agencies, the courts, law enforcement, and the armed services. Monitor the independence of the Commission on Elections, the courts, the military, the police, teachers, and all other individuals and entities involved in the conduct of the election.
Highlight the efforts of public and private sectors to uphold the honesty and integrity of our elections, monitoring vote buying, campaign spending, and the use of public funds to win elections.
Contextualize reporting on surveys and the winnability of candidates. We will not report on surveys without verifying the polling data, the track records of the companies conducting the polls, the methodologies used, and the questions asked. Focus on voter education, citizen participation, and empowerment.
Organize and report on town halls and debates and encourage candidates and citizens to take part in them. Uphold codes of ethics and professional conduct and disclose potential conflicts of interest.
Make a clear distinction between reportage and opinion. Promote safety, public health, and security protocols for and among journalists, and be mindful of the impact of our work on the safety and well-being of the people and communities we interact with in the course of our reporting.
Share best practices, knowledge, and experience, and raise our individual and collective capacities and competencies in covering elections, as well as the politics, issues, policies, leaders, and people beyond the elections.
All right, I guess it's my part. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. We are joined today by esteemed journalists who will share their experiences in covering the 2022 elections, rightly described as one of the most consequential Philippine elections in decades, and also provide some insight on the state of media freedom in the Philippines. Right after, we will have a short open forum where we will accept questions from the gallery for our speakers. So pakihanda na po yung mga tanong. You can send it through the chat box for those who are joining us from Zoom. So let's begin with our first speaker, Christian Isguera, is a political journalist and an educator. He hosts Facts First, a political talk show streamed live on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It tackles burning issues on politics and governance and is devoted to combating disinformation. He is the former anchor of the hard-hitting political talk program After the Fact on the ABS-CBN News Channel. He began his career as a reporter for the Philippine Daily Inquirer in 2000, then joined ABS-CBN as a news correspondent and anchor in 2015. He teaches political reporting and journalism ethics at the University of Santo Tomas. He was awarded the Marshall McLuhan Fellowship in 2020. In 2019, he received the Award of Distinction from the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility and the Titus Brandsma Award for Emergent Leadership in Journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, Christian Esguerra.
Hi, thank you, Atom, for that introduction. Maraming salamat. So, I'm happy to be in the company of friends and colleagues, as mentioned by Carmela earlier. Pero honestly, I would wish that we are joined by the public at large talaga. So talaga mas marami sila dito. Kasi yung mga pinag-uusapan natin dito sa journalism, tayo-tayo at alam na natin yung problema, di ba? So, isa sa mga problema, paano ba natin ma-engage lalo yung publiko, no? So I'll speak more in Filipino, although I use English to say that, no? So mag-share muna ako ng screen ko. This is a very short presentation. Sakto lang po siya, I hope, doon sa 10-minute allotment provided for me for this presentation. So sa akin, very simple yung problema natin ngayon dito sa industriya at dun sa demokrasya natin sa kabuuan dito sa Pilipinas. So I titled this presentation, A Necessary Good versus an Unnecessary Evil. So challenges to press freedom in the 2022 elections. So let's be frank, ano ba yung pinaka-problema natin dito? Pwede tayo dumating dun sa point na yung boto natin, yung magiging decision natin sa Lunes, sa May 9, ay produkto ng isang widespread, well-planned, and well-funded disinformation campaign. And we know for a fact who is actually benefiting from this. Yung ibang mga kandidato for president, tumbukin na natin. Meron silang kanya-kanyang mga supporters. Siguro you would like to call those groups of supporters as line troll networks or siguro social media teams. Pero to be honest, marami sa kanila meron tinatawag na ganyang grupo, and some of them, I suppose, meron talagang troll armies or line troll networks. So imagine a vote manipulated by a widespread, well-planned, and well-funded disinformation campaign. Yun ang pang-isipan natin. Kaya yung trabaho ng journalist, nakaukit na eh. Kumbaga, we have our work cut out for us. Ano ba yung pwede natin gawin para labanan to? Napakahirap sa totoo lang, no? For example, journalists are fighting back. We are fighting back, but with a severe handicap. Ano tong handicap na to? Unang-unang credibility natin is under siege. Even some of our colleagues are questioning our manner of reporting, di ba? Yung mga napaka-basic na konsepto, minsan kailangan ituro uli o ipaalala doon sa ibang mga kasama natin. Hindi lang yung mga mas bata, sometimes pati yung mga mas matanda. For example, yung very basic idea ng false balance, di ba? So, yung false balance na yan, dahil hindi naintindihan ng marami sa mga consumers natin ng balita, nagagamit yan laban sa atin ng mga propagandists. I remember nagamit yan before, during the height of the franchise issue ng ABS-CBN. Ang isa sa mga taong gobyerno na gumamit yan, and I experienced this firsthand, yung dating speaker, Alan Peter Cayetano. Diba siya yung pinaka point person, isa sa mga point person si President Duterte sa Kongreso para hindi maibigay yung prangkisa ng ABS-CBN at para mapanatili siyang sarado. So I remember in the very first hearing that they conducted, after that, Alan Peter Cayetano held a press conference. And he confronted me during that live press conference. Ang reklamo niya, bakit daw ng 2019 elections, mas marami raw yung interview doon sa programa namin tungkol doon sa mga nagre-reklamo doon sa political dynasty nila sa Taguig. Pinilang niya. So, una hindi nag-register sa utak ko, ano ba nare-reklamo nito? I thought he was talking about yung mga teleserye, soap opera, etc. Yung pala reklamo niya, bakit daw mas maraming episodes devoted yung programa, yung talk show namin ng time na yon, doon sa mga nagrereklamo sa kanya. And then later on, sinasabi niya bakit yung side namin ganitong beses lang na-interview. I remember isa rin sa mga nag-guest ko ng time na yun, si Attorney George Garcia, abogado niya, na ngayon ay Comelec Commissioner. And is actually doing a good job so far, no? So I was waiting for him to raise that issue of false balance during the actual hearings, yung talagang papalapit na yung hora de peligro. But fortunately, he didn't raise that because in a sense, he didn't have to kasi talagang patay na yung franchise application. So yung ganyan, yung false balance, kitang-kita natin, ginagamit sa atin to benefit certain propagandists and political actors, di ba? So ito, ano yung handicap na binabanggit natin dito? Our credibility number one is under siege from purveyors of disinformation. At sino-sino sila? Una-una yung gobyerno, mga taga-gobyerno mismo, yung nagkakalat ng disinformation. Pangalawa yung enablers nila. So, minsan dito sa kumakalat na kasinungalingan dito sa kampanya, minsan hindi mo talaga masisi yung mga ordinary Filipinos, yung mga news consumers. Kasi sila na-manipulate eh. Kaya diba, for example, lumabas tayo sa kalye, sasabihin, wala naman kayo, hindi namin kayo pinapaniwalaan, Rappler, puro kayo kasinungalingan, ABS-CBN, puro kayo paninira sa kay BBM, di ba? Hindi mo sila masisi kasi most likely, biktima sila nung matinding disinformation infrastructure na binuo nito mga taong mas nakakaalam at yung may pondo. So dapat ang accountability nandun sa state actors na nagkakalat ng fake information, dun sa enablers nila, at dun sa private contractors nila. I use the term private contractors to refer to the troll farms, yung mga blind troll networks. Sila yan. Yung mga vloggers for sale. Yung dati nagpapagamit kay Bongbong, ngayon nagpapagamit na kay Isko. Yung mga dati nagpapagamit kay Duterte, ngayon na kay Isko na yung iba na kay Bongbong Marcos. So these are private contractors eh. So lahat yan, pag pinagsama-sama, mas nakakadagdag doon sa problema kinakaharap natin. Kasi ano ba yung pinaka-role ng journalist dito sa isang election, for example? Maglabas lang ba tayo ng side ng isang kandidato? Ipakita lang ba natin yung nangyari? Which is, to me, very silly. Pag pinanood yung mga newscast, karaniwan, di ba? Kasama dyan. Ako na masyado na akong prangka. Anyway, panoorin niyo yung newscast sa gabi, di ba? Papapansin niyo ang balita lagi, binisita ni Isko Moreno. Samantala, binisita ni Bongbong Marcos. Nakapagpulong si Ping Lacson. Si Leni Robredo, dito naman dumalo sa ganitong pagtitipon. Yung reporting na kung ano yung nakita, yun i-report. Kasi masasense mo na within newsrooms, meron talagang effort to be objective, quote-unquote. Kasi takot sila mabanatan ng mga kandidato na being unfair, di ba? So hindi na dinidikta yung coverage dun sa campaign, doon sa kung ano dapat yung malaman ng tao. Wala man tayong pakialam kung nakipagpulong sa ganito, di ba? Ano ba yung sinabi? Ano yung meaning ng presence ng mga taong nandun? At fortunately, mas nakikita natin yan, yung accountability na yan, yung konteksto na yan, doon sa social media. So social media, as mentioned kanina by Ma'am Melinda, it can be a force for good and it can also be a force for evil, di ba? So in some sense, yung konteksto na yan na hindi binibigay ng mainstream media kasi takot at nagsi-self-censorship, fortunately nakukuha natin doon sa ibang nasa social media. Which brings me to the next issue, yung self-censorship. I honestly believe ang tindi ng problema natin ngayon dahil dumating sa point yung industriya natin, karamihan, yung marami sa atin, hindi ko sinasabing karamihan, may mga newsrooms na hindi mo na kailangan i-censor eh. Kasi sila mismo nagsisensor sa sarili nila. Inisip nila, mananalo itong kandidato na to, hindi natin sila pwedeng banatan. Bakit? Siguro kasi yung interest ng kumpanya na may-ari, mako-compromise. Okay? So nasaan yung element of journalism dun sa punto na yon? Ito nga yung pagkakataon na mas kailangan mo yung trabaho ng isang periodista para mas mapanagot yung mga tao. Even basic questions like competence. Would you believe na in my previous program, yung mga basic question na yan, tinanong mo yung competence ng isang kandidato, makakarinig ka at magkakaroon ka ng problema. Basic questions. Lahat ng journalist dapat itanong yan, di ba? Competent ba si Manny Pacquiao? Competent ba si Leni Robredo? Competent ba si Ping Lacson? Competent ba si Bongbong Marcos? Kanya-kanya kasi pagtingin yan eh. May mga kandidatong pag tinanong mo yung competence sila. Fortunately, si Manny Pacquiao, miski alam mong nasa-sense mo talaga nililibak siya ng iba, di ba? Hindi believe sa kanya. Pero sinasagot niya. Pero bakit pag may mga kandidato, for example, noong time na yon, si Bongo, I question his competence on air. Nagreklamo yan. Okay? So, hindi ba siya patas na tanong? Bakit ka tumatakbo? Why are you gunning for the highest position in the land, yet you don't want to answer such basic questions? Tulad yan na sinasabi ng marami, and I would like to paraphrase them, the way you campaign indicates most likely how you will govern and how you will deal with the media. So ito yung situation na meron tayo ngayon. Napaka-restrictive at tayo mismo sa industriya, marami sa atin, hindi na kailangan pagsabihan eh. Kumbaga nagiging timid, nagiging subservient, nagiging servile. Talagang nakakatakot eh. Alam mo na, di ba? Pwede mo wala yung trabaho, pwede mo wala yung ganito, ganyan-ganyan. Ito pa, this is what's worse. Suddenly, we're in a situation where we have to explain and justify a reason for being. Bakit pa kasi kailangan ng mga journalists? I mean, we're plunging further and further into the depths of ridiculousness, to be honest with it. Kailangan pa ipaliwanag, bakit ka ba nandyan? Bakit ba kailangan na reporters? Nandiyan naman si Tony Gonzaga, nandiyan naman yung mga vloggers, di ba? Nandiyan naman yung mga pwede mag-interview sa mga politiko. Ito po yung sagot doon. Ang journalist, basta matino, hindi nagpapabayad, hindi nagpapagamit, hindi po yung mga paid hacks. Siya yung magpoproseso, siya po yung magsasabi sa inyo kung yung sinabi ng politiko tama o hindi. Siya po yung magbibigay ng konteksto doon sa sinabi. For example, ikaw news consumer, pwede ka naman dumiretso sa senatorial candidate, di ba? Pumunta ka sa website niya, pumunta ka sa Facebook page niya. Pero anong guarantee mo na lahat ng sinabi niya, totoo? Bakit? Kasi iba ng objective ang kandidato, ang politiko, doon sa objective ng journalist. Ang objective ng kandidato, nakakita na ba kayo ng kandidato siniraan yung sarili niya? Ay, hindi nga po ako masyado magaling. Actually, bobo po ako. Wala po talaga ako napatunayan nung naupo ako sandali sa Kongreso. Pero ngayon gusto ko pong tumakbo sa mas mataas na posisyon. Walang magsasabi nun. They will sugarcoat everything. Sino dapat magsabi nun? Yung journalist, not the way I said it, but by providing hard facts. So yun po, pag pinag-usapan ng track record, paano natin mahima yung track record kung masyado na-distract yung mga reporters? Binobombard tayo ng mga trolls, kung ano-ano yung mga sinasabi sa atin, dinidistract tayo para yung trabaho natin, hindi natin magawa. Ganyan kasakla po yung situation natin ngayon. Now, I posed this question. I posed this question in my class last week, in our ethics class. Imagine a world, imagine a Philippines without journalists. Pwede naman, di ba? Hindi naman tayo parang doktor na, pag walang doktor, walang manggagamot eh. Okay. Sige, imagine for a while. Walang journalist dito sa Pilipinas. Okay. Eventually, sooner or later, and I hope it would be sooner and it wouldn't be late or too late, journalism would have to exist. Journalism would have to reinvent itself. Journalism would have to resurrect itself. Because yung basic idea ng pagkuha man ng detalye na verified, basic yun eh. Hindi mo kailangan lagyan ng tatak na journalism eh. Tao mismo marirealize niya, walang journalist, okay, walang mga news organizations. Pero yung pinaka-proseso ng pagkalap ng impormasyon, pagbihis dito, pagproseso dito, at pag yung lahat dito sa impormasyon na to, marirealize sila, di ba ito yung ginagawa ng journalism na binabanatan natin dati? Bakit natin sila binabanatan dati? Bakit tayo hindi nagtitiwala dati? Bakit mas nagtitiwala tayo kina Thinking Pinoy? Bakit mas nagtitiwala tayo sa SMNI? Bakit mas nagtitiwala tayo dun sa mga celebrity influencers na kung ano mga pinagtatanong sa mga tumatakbo, di ba? Marirealize nila, kailangan pala talaga ng journalism. Kahit hindi nyo lagyan ng label. The very essence of journalism cannot be removed from society in a democratic society. So, this is how I would like to end this presentation, because journalism is a necessary good in the face of an unnecessary evil, which is disinformation. And this is what is confronting all of us today. Thank you.
Right. Maraming salamat, Christian, for your frank assessment. You have surely dealt with a lot of cow dung in your life. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Before joining the Mindanao Gold Star Daily, Kong worked as the Deputy Director of the Multimedia Desk of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, or PCIJ. And before that, he served as a writing fellow of Vera Files. Under the pen name Kong, Leonardo Vicente B. Corrales has worked as a print journalist since 2008. Corrales has published news, in-depth, investigative, and feature articles on agrarian reform, peace and dialogue initiatives, climate justice, and social economics in local and international news organizations, which includes, among others, the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Business World, Mindanews, Interaction.com, Agence France Presse, Xinhua Newswires, Thomson Reuters Newswires, UCAnews.com, and PecoJohn-PH. He is currently the editor-in-chief of Mindanao Gold Star Daily. Our next speaker is Kong Corrales. Take it away. Nakamute ka ata, Kong.
Ay, good morning. Good noon pala sa lahat. Thank you very much, Atom, for the introduction. Ang assignment ko dito is ibigay yung experience namin in covering the election. So part of covering ng election, I mean to be specific, yung campaign, we joined a fact-checking coalition. At saka nung March 17, inatake yung website namin. It started 9 a.m. Hindi ko na mabubuksan yung admin account ng website namin. And then by 10 a.m., wala na talaga. Kahit na yung mga readers namin, yung mga suki naming readers, hindi na nakakapasok. So, problema namin kasi maliit lang kami na news organization. We mainly report on Northern Mindanao. And because of the pandemic, skeleton staff na kami. So, kawawa nga yung IT team namin, IT team of one, kasi dahil dun sa attack. By 12 midnight, pasalamat ako sa yung sinalayhan namin na fact-checking coalition kasi nagbigay sila ng tech support. Na-establish namin yung mga measures for against the DDoS attack, no? And we found out na kaya pala nag-collapse yung website namin. Over 60 million IP addresses tried to access, no, at the same time. So kaya nag-collapse yun. Alas 3 na ng kinabukasan, the next day, nag-return yung na-regain namin ang control. Buti na lang intact yung data namin. And immediately after that, the DDoS attack, our news organization was red tagged, and I was red tagged individually for the nth time. Kasi nga ang ginamit pa ay yung screen grab nung fact check na ginawa namin. At saka yung fact check na ginawa namin was yung claim ni Marcos Jr. Na kanyang project yung windmills. So what have we picked up on this events is merong well-coordinated and well-funded attack, no? Direct attack on mainstream media, news media outlets, at saka it serves as it gives a chilling, no? You can't help it. Yun nga yung sinabi ni Christian, you can't help it. Meron talagang chilling effect na to the point na you start to censor yourself. However, meron naman tayong support groups, mga editors din ng ibang outlets that give us, that encourages us, no? Encourages our small paper not not to give in to this, because kung susuko tayo, paano na lang? No? And I also think that because of the weaponization of social media, no, if you recall, this started long before this election. Yung sa 2016 nga, yun lang ang pag-pick nila for the first time. Matagal na yung mga trolls, di ba? And yun nga, it is endangering press freedom in a way that maraming yun nga, nagsisensor na lang ng kanilang sarili. And that is detrimental first for the people's, the public's right to know, no? To know and for them to have educated and intelligent choices, especially with things that will affect us later, specifically itong darating na eleksyon. So sa tingin ko kasi yun ang challenges, no? So tingin ko dapat mas pag-igihan pa natin at mas mag-close ranks pa tayo, because there's always strength in numbers. And napapasalamat din ako sa mga Manila-based or bigger news media organizations na natuto na rin, no, na tulungan yung mga maliliit na news media organizations. Yun lang po, and maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Kong, for the very important work that you do in the regions. I'd like to remind everyone nga pala who's tuned in, again, kung meron po kayong mga tanong sa ating mga speakers, please share them in the chat box, or you can send them to any of the organizers, and we will do our best to read it out later sa ating open forum. All right, moving on to our last speaker. Regine Cabato is the Washington Post's Manila reporter. She has sat in a troll farm, interviewed moderators filtering disturbing social media content, and is monitoring disinformation ahead of the 2022 elections. Her investigation into a rape case against a parish priest in rural Philippines was a finalist for the Society of Asia Publishers Award. She is a board member at the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines, and her commentary has been featured on ABC, BBC, and CNN, among others. Ladies and gentlemen, Regine.
Thank you, Atom. At maraming salamat din sa PCIJ for having me today. Pasensya na po at wala pa akong slides to share, although I would like to point you to our recently released statement from the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines in time for World Press Freedom Day today. In that particular statement, we raised alarm and concern over how difficult it is for those of us who cover one presidential candidate in particular, Mr. Bongbong Marcos. Members from over a dozen organizations, myself included, have not heard back from our applications for media accreditation. We've not received replies to requests for comment, not received responses to other coverage-related inquiries. And I think it's no secret in the industry that those who write about the Marcos family are more vulnerable to harassment than if you write about other candidates. So siguro sisimulan ko by sharing about my own experience, which I also posted about on Facebook and Twitter, if you guys will want to look at the screen caps. I kind of had a feeling early on that it will be difficult to cover this particular campaign. So I turned to a medium where I could find some concrete answers or evidence or kind of look at trends. And that was the online trail. What came out of that immersion was a months-long investigation on historical revisionism online, which academics have pointed out has actually began decades ago, actually, and which moved online or migrated online from sort of fringe offline propaganda. And all of this is to say that there has been data, there has been research that shows that there is a very deliberate and well-funded machinery that basically serves a certain family's interest for this particular elections. The report that came out of that investigation, thankfully, seems to have been widely read. And I also know that it struck a nerve because it reached the attention of propagandists. And a barrage of hate afterwards poured into my inbox and mentions and notifications. Ito siguro yung pangatlong experience ko ng organized harassment campaign. The first two were in 2020 and then 2021 about how Twitter took down hundreds of accounts that were defending President Duterte's pandemic response through very sketchy hashtags. And another one was also about a comment on pandemic coverage. Now, I know these campaigns are likely to be organized because they come at very odd hours. For some reason, yung trolls na nangatake sa akin ay halos parating na sa midnight shift or madaling araw nagme-message. And sometimes the timestamps hardly differ, no? So that in itself is very suspicious. And some of the accounts in my spam folder from last year on Messenger are now non-existent, which I think is very telling. The attacks proves that the disinformation machinery and the culture of hate it inspires in our report are actually true. Pero I have no doubt about it na ilan sa mga messages na to are from real people. Pero alin ang mas masaklap, no? Na ginagawa mo ito dahil trabaho mo or dahil trip mo lang? That's the kind of atmosphere that we live and operate in currently in this profession. And mine is just one experience among many in the professional press. Siguro I'll also take this opportunity to plug one of my advocacies, which is to provide training for student journalists. And I want to share that the past 6 years have not been easy for the student press. Both high school and college papers have been stopped from publishing, not just by faculty administrators, but also they've been intimidated because of self-censorship and the chilling effect of the current atmosphere. They've been cyberbullied and intimidated, sometimes not at the hands of just random trolls or strangers online, but sometimes from alumni and government officials as well. Freedom of the press does not mean freedom just to operate, as some propagandists would like to paint it. It also means freedom from fear, freedom from harassment. That even when readers disagree with your work or how you cover it, they won't flood your inbox with threats. And that there is a basic grasp and understanding of the role of the press and public interest. Most of the messages I noticed against me or sent to my inbox or that I were tagged in were designed to question my credibility, paint me as a foreign-funded or planted journalist. At palagay ko deliberate yon because in the absence of outright physical threats, it's easier na hindi tanggalin sa social media yung ganitong mga gray area comments, as opposed to if it's an outright physical threat, right? Which may be a clear violation of social media rules. Pag-attack sa credibility, it can actually stay up and remain available for the public to read on these comment sections. After 2 years, there is a blatantly false blog post by a propagandist claiming that the Washington Post retracted a previous story of mine. And it still comes up on Google search results for my name. Now, in the past few weeks, there have been a lot of accounts that barrage me, that message me, tag me, asking where's my evidence, who is my source, etc. for this story. But the sources are actually clearly cited in my article. Although I already got the feeling that no matter what evidence I shared within or outside of the Washington Post paywall, it would fall on deaf ears. Because we're already living in the upside down, where left is right. We have a very distorted view of reality. And many people won't believe that billions of dollars were stolen from state coffers, despite the receipts, despite the international reports, despite the court rulings. But people will believe in an abstract theory about gold being potentially distributed. Having trailed volunteers in house-to-house campaigns recently, nakikita rin natin na yung effect ng disinformation ay minsan na-translate na sa behavior modification. There are some people who are so averse to a genuine conversation. They threaten volunteers, they pour water on volunteers' heads. It's very disturbing, and although many people are still open to conversation, are still open to listening, I and my colleagues fear that 6 more years of coordinated attacks on the press and the erosion of institutions and public trust will empower violent actions like this even more. So this coming election, I think, will definitely test how far gone the truth is in this highly online country. And I really hope that we pass that test. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regine, for your very courageous reporting, I have to say. At this point, we'd like to take questions from the gallery. Meron na pong mga nagpadala dito. Let's start with Pavel. He asks, what can the traditional media do to stay relevant in the election when so many voters openly state that they get their information primarily from social media, where, as we all know, facts cannot be separated from disinformation? Are we, as media, doing enough to bring the message to the public? And he thanks the audience. He's a Czech journalist currently in Manila to cover the elections. Sino po ang gustong manguna sa pagsagot dito? Maybe you can ask Christian kasi nakapagpahinga na siya ng konti.
Okay. So dapat English, no? Czech siya, no? Okay. Greetings from Manila. Okay. What can the traditional media do to address this issue? I think we've been doing that already over the past several years, basically to reinvent ourselves, find new ways of reporting, basically go where the audiences are, where the news consumers are. I think at the start, I was very, very reluctant. And still, it brings a lot of discomfort on my part to be on TikTok. And honestly, I would never, ever find myself dancing on TikTok. But I decided to open an account because I noticed there are a lot of news consumers there. And honestly, there are more trolls based on my experience on TikTok compared to YouTube or Facebook. So my point is, there has to be this constant effort to reinvent ourselves, to find the platforms, be good at those platforms, because our news consumers are also there. If I may add, I think a few years ago, philstar.com provided some discomfort to traditional journalists when they decided to come up with memes as part of their reporting arsenal. I myself was not that comfortable with that. But then I realized these people are doing a good job in terms of providing information, bits and pieces of information to a specific segment of the news consumers. And I think, looking back, that has been very, very effective.
Salamat, Christian. Does anyone want to add? Basically,
May rejoinder ako, Atom. Actually, Mindanao Gold Star Daily has been print, that was our primary product. But now after the pandemic, when the pandemic happened, we huddled and we realized that we need to switch priorities. That's why we have made our online presence our priority, and the support will be the print. That's how we address that issue of becoming still relevant still with the new voters. We have also given into more other platforms, online products like podcasts over several platforms, audio platforms, and YouTube. But sadly, hindi pa kami nakapasok sa TikTok. So mabuhay ka, Christian. Sayang naman kung hindi tayo makita, magsayaw ka doon. Salamat, Tato.
Regine, do you want to add?
Yes, siguro dadagdag lang ako. I agree with what was previously said. Definitely, we need to go where the audiences are. So actually, so much kudos to Christian because of his program, which has migrated practically to YouTube, where a lot of people, where the audiences are really based on studies, they really tune into long form stuff. And we need factual content there because YouTube is just overrun by propagandists. So it's great that Christian is producing content there to counter that. And I think other newsrooms need to invest in similar infrastructure. Researcher Fatima Gao, who has been researching on platforms like YouTube, mentioned that every platform has a certain vernacular, quote and unquote. So every platform has a language. The stuff you produce on TikTok is different, should have a different approach, different edit, different style from what you produce on Facebook, Twitter. It should be packaged differently, basically, across all social media platforms. One of the interesting things that I've noticed about working in an international organization like the Post is that we invested early actually on TikTok. So we have quite a prolific TikTok team that kind of grew in the past couple of years. And it's very well received in the international circuit. We had a training recently with a TikTok producer our TikTok producer from the Post and Jackie Manabat of ABS-CBN, where we got them as speakers to teach Gen Z student journalists how to produce content, responsible news content for TikTok that is also engaging. Because honestly, while like Christian, I'm also scared of stepping onto the platform and would be intimidated regarding public dancing and such. No, he's right. Basically, it's where the audience is, and what better people to produce content for this platform than people who are also from the audience, the Gen Zers. So I think we really need newsrooms. We need to empower the youth. And we need to put in place within our own newsrooms teams, basically. Bumuo tayo ng teams, bumuo tayo ng proper pay, proper compensation for people who have journalistic training, but who also understand the language of content creation. No? So I think that's basically kind of where we're at. I think we should also be open to maybe possible collaborations with influencers or social media personalities whose values align with ours, right? Who understand the importance of a free press. So those are some things that we can look at, I think, as an industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Regine. Yes, go ahead. Melinda, ano yan?
Right. Okay. Take it from me. I'm in my 70s, late 70s. I have to say, you need to reinvent. You need to go to where they are. I believe that journalism will continue to exist if you become creative enough. Whatever the vernacular of a particular platform, learn it and you're going to deliver. That is where we have to go. In time, as I hope, as literacy, a believer in reading and in books, these will retain its place. And out of that and the other new ways of telling the stories, we should be able to enrich that exchange. And I wanted to say this because I know I'm probably the oldest person in this forum, that I believe that the future lies in the creativity of you young journalists who are going to move into those areas. And hopefully out of that, we will regain our place as truth tellers and telling the stories that really need to be heard. Thank you, Atom, for giving me that little time.
Yeah. Si Sir Howie Severino asked us a very pragmatic question. I'm interested in what our speakers can share. He asked, can anyone share scenarios for the media in case of a Marcos presidency? Sige, let's begin with Kong na muna. Kong.
What do we expect?
Mm-hmm. What are the scenarios for media in case of a Marcos presidency?
I guess there will be an online mosquito press, just like what happened to in the time of his dad. Certainly, you cannot. I think we will still be there, but it would be challenging, I guess. But ang naiba lang sa ating generation ngayon, Atom, kasi is meron tayong cyber superhighway. So unless they do what China did with Google, then I think we'll still go on. Medyo pahirapan nga lang, pero yun ang in-expect ko. Kung meron mang massive censorship na mangyayari, which I expect under a Marcos president, under a Marcos regime, hindi meron pa ring lilitaw, except that online mosquito press na ang mangyayari. Parang mosquito press 2.0.
Yeah.
Salamat, Adam.
Thank you, Kong. Regine.
One of the things that I'm expecting is institutional support and the further embedding of propagandists or hyper-partisan who sow discord and distrust for the press. And that's something we've already seen, right, in 2016, that they've been given somewhat more priority for access than the mainstream media, right? But one thing that I've noticed, having been immersed in TikTok and such for reporting, is that the Marcos machinery is a lot more sophisticated and slick and quick on its feet than Duterte's machinery. So they adjust more easily to the vernacular of new platforms like TikTok. They've been on YouTube for decades or more. When the internet was first there, according to academics, they were on Friendster and they were on Flickr. So I think that's something we'll definitely have to watch out for. And it's something that we have to keep at pace with as members of the mainstream media, because they have already established their echo chambers. They've established a support base such that there will be, I think, a steady influx of hatred for the press, even when they're not deploying their troll farms, right? So that's something we definitely have to watch out for. Difficulty of access is also something that we'll probably be expecting. We're already seeing it now in the campaign trail, right? They're very difficult. The camp is difficult to reach. It's difficult to get comment from them. Even if Mr. Marcos has said that he is open to interviews with the media, we all know from experience that it doesn't reflect in actions on the ground, right? So definitely that's another thing that we'll have to watch out for and prepare for. I think what can the mainstream press do about this? Since we are seeing a lot of crowdsourced content now, for example, in relation to the opposition candidates' campaign, we're seeing a lot of creative content from influencers, etc. Without leaning into partisan, promotion. I think there's something to be learned from creative content creation that comes from social media personalities, directors, digital creatives who are not with the press and who are volunteers. Basically, we need more stuff or more content that will, for example, be like the first portion of the recent ad from Boots Ads on Roa, where she talks about her experience of martial law. We need more stuff that is like the ad that Karma produced, I think a few years back, where millennials face elders who are survivors of martial law. We cannot stop with single advertisements like that or single campaigns like that. We need to produce more content that is like that. We need to counter the content on Pro Marcos YouTube and Pro Marcos TikTok, which shows elders talking about the golden era, etc. We need to record and package for a new generation these stories of survivors. We can't just let them fall into the ether. So those are some things that we should definitely be preparing ourselves to cover in event of a Marcos presidency.
Christian,
I agree.
how are you
I agree.
prepared?
How I am preparing for a Marcos presidency. I wish I could I wish I could answer that with greater clarity. Alam mo, part of me is thinking, siguro naman si Bongbong Marcos, no, if he gets elected president, perhaps he might grow into the position, not decay into it. Perhaps he might suddenly turn into a statesman, someone who looks after the welfare of the nation. Because in the first place, he had been preaching the idea of unity. Pero bilis lang siguro 10-second thought experiment lang sa akin yan. Because you have to look at the candidate. You have to look at the track record. You have to look at how he has been dealing with media, how he has been looking at the free press since their years in Malacanang. And those things would automatically lead you to a very likely conclusion. There would be more suppression of the press. There would be less freedom, even further. Even there would be more control of newsrooms. Doon yung makikita na siguro mas magkakaroon ng self-censorship ang mga tao, ang mga news organizations. Kasi nasa kapangyarihan na si Marcos eh. Kasi ngayon pala nararamdaman na natin sa mga newsrooms, di ba? The worst type of censorship is self-censorship, and we're seeing that already. What more pag nanalo siya? So we cannot expect him to change overnight na baka naman talaga magiging unifying president siya. Maniwala pa kayo sa akin. I saw this before kay President Duterte. I remember having this conversation with a friend asking me, mukhang okay si President Duterte, no? And inisip ko siguro for 10 seconds, baka okay si Presidente. O baka naman okay si Duterte maging presidente. In the context of journalism to, no? Sabi ko, pero hindi eh. Imagine ba how he dealt with the Davao Press. Talagang hinawakan niya yung community papers na, no? Except for some news organizations na talagang tumindig, nagpaka-independent. And tingnan nyo, paano ba naging takbo nung malayong pamamahayag under President Duterte. We had to fight for our freedom viciously under President Duterte. And the worst part is, after President Duterte, if Bongbong Marcos is elected president, imagine the template provided by Duterte that will now be enjoyed and can now be used by Bongbong Marcos to further suppress press freedom. Naipasara niya yung ABS-CBN without declaring martial law. Diba? Hindi niya kailangan talagang magpadala ng mga pulis tsaka ng mga sundalo para switch off yung power. Automatically, nag-order yung NTC, walang kalaban-laban. Talaga, hindi, sige, sasaran na po namin. Okay. Kumbaga, very naive approach, diba, to such a threat or actual action coming from the government. What more pag si Bongbong Marcos na, do you honestly believe na bubuksan yung ABS-CBN? Kung buksan man, siguro maraming kapalit, di ba? Do you think mas magiging maganda yung pakikitungo niya sa ibang mga news organizations sa tingin niya critical? I don't think so. Expect a lot of revenge, retribution, payback as far as the Marcos regime is concerned. And doon natin makikita na talagang doon natin marirealize na hindi pala niya kailangan ang mainstream media. Kasi infrastructure niya nandun eh. Bakit niya kailangang kausapin ng Inquirer? Bakit niya kailangan kausapin ng Philippine Star? Pwede naman niyang takutin, di ba? Yung gusto niya ipalabas, pwede namang dumaan dun sa infrastructure ng disinformation na ginamit niya during the campaign. Ang worst part dito, pondo po ng mga taong bayan. Pondo natin yung magagamit dito against us. So ito yung classic example na darating yung point na tayo yung magigisa sa sarili nating mantika.
Right. Thank you so much, Christian, for your very optimistic outlook. Then loko lang, no? I mean, obviously, you're all concerned about the future of media in the Philippines. Meron po tayong question na pinadala sa Facebook from Michael Henry Yusinko. And I'd like to invite Ma'am Melinda to answer this question first of all. Should Filipinos bear more responsibility in empowering online, or disempowering rather, online disinformation?
Should
Filipinos bear more responsibility in disempowering online disinformation?
Meaning, should there be a broader, wider, deeper response, engaging not just the media, but other actors as well, including schools, institutions, student groups, student organizations. This should be like an ongoing thing in every campus. Do you have a symposium going on addressing the issue of disinformation and looking at it in the eye and checking how, in fact, the use of it has spread through your student communities, etc., etc. If those institutions are not set to do this, then we are doomed. We are not going to get out of this mess. It has to be a societal response. It can't just be media, because the power of the media draws out of the communities that it serves. And we must link with them, as we said a little while back, we must link with human rights defenders. We must also link with the institutions of learning. We must look at how DepEd holds back these institutions of learning and all the other agencies as well. We need to move our lenses down to how and where these weaknesses are and come out with that message and basically say, if you're not going to do it, don't expect us to be able to succeed. Why? Because you get them before we get them. You're there before we get them. And I say churches should also be part of that societal response. Why? Where do we get our values? Where do we get that grid that we are supposed to add on to in terms of how we defend ourselves as a society and develop ourselves as a democracy? Democracy is for all the moral good that churches talk about they want to present. Let's examine that. Let's go there and also work with them so that they can join the small broken efforts of media, because that is what we are. We are a small and broken sector that will have to rebuild ourselves. We can do it if the people are behind us.
Right. Thank you so much. I think that also maybe covers the question about how to educate the Class D and E in our society about the true news and journalism, although I'm sure that's not the entire picture right there. We have a few more minutes to wrap up the open forum. Marami pang tanong, no? Sorry, hindi natin mababasa lahat. I have one question though for all of our speakers. Obviously, we cannot minimize the effect of social media, which has exploded in the past, let's just say, decade, in the situation that we find ourselves in. Did any of you foresee the extent of disinformation and how effective a platform social media will be in delivering that kind of maybe societal or mind conditioning? And maybe moving forward, is there a way of turning the tide around, or maybe to use the amazing power of social media in conditioning, or let's just say in convincing people about what they should do and what the facts are? Siguro, I'll roll out na lang, ha? Ano? Sinong?
Una na ako, Atom, nagkakahayaan eh.
Go.
Sige. Honestly, hindi ko siya anticipate. Honestly, I was one of those naive people who thought na siguro the marketplace of ideas concept would actually work in a situation like this.
Yeah.
And then later on, I realized, no, that template, that perspective wouldn't work. Kasi nabanggit ko rin ito sa ibang mga forums eh. Yung marketplace of ideas concept, it would only work kung wala kang mga big tech companies controlling the platform. Ang situation natin kasi ngayon, yung merkado mismo, yung market, kontrolado ng Facebook, ng YouTube, ng TikTok. So ibig sabihin, nagkakaroon tayo ng kanya-kanyang worldviews, depende rin sa dinidikta ng mga big tech companies. Eh ano ba yung primary motivation algorithms nila ba? Basically for marketing, di ba? For views. So ngayon, we're forced to adapt to this situation because this exploded right in our faces eh. So ang hirap eh. So what can we do? Eto na, nadidinig natin lagi sa iba, di ba? We have to hold them accountable. Mas marami silang pwedeng gawin kumpara sa atin eh. Kasi sila may hawak dun sa dun sa gripo, di ba? I'm not saying turn off, talagang tawag dito, suppress free speech. Hindi ganun eh. Pero pag alam mo talagang sobrang kalokohan ng sinabi, huwag mo nang bigyan ng additional avenues for further viewing. Tapos siguro on the part of journalists, kahit reluctant yung karamihan sa atin dahil we were born, we were nurtured in an environment of traditional platforms. Siguro we have to populate these new platforms and use ito. Sorry for putting you on the spot, Atom. No, si Atom, he has so much clout. Imagine ko si Atom, mas nasa TikTok, mas nasa YouTube, mas maraming manonood, mas maraming makikinig. Pag si Atom nagsabi, for example, ito kalokohan itong Taliana Gold. Between me tsaka the rest dito, pag samasamahin yung clout namin, kung meron man, I mean, sorry for putting you on the spot, di ba? Pero that's the way it is, di ba? We have to put, yung clout na yan, I have to admit, recent discovery yung term na yan sa social media. Sabi ko, ano ba tawag sa mga tao may followers or influence? Clout daw, okay? A negative part ng clout chasing, okay? So, let's use whatever clout or influence or following we have to actually address or put up a counterattack to this disinformation campaign. And marami tayong magagawa. So, we cannot surrender or raise the white flag.
Sige, practicing ko na yung dance moves ko.
Pasensya na, Atom, ha. Naalala lang kita
The Taliano Gold situation. I think that will save us. Regine and Kong, isasama ko na yung ibang mga questions kasi ang dami talaga, and I think these are really important to address. From PUP COC, JM, from JM, basically tinatanong niya, kasi nakita raw nila kung paano nag-erode yung trust in journalism. How would you attempt to restore public trust to rely more on credible media organizations? Baka pwedeng isama na rin yun, Regine and Kong, sa inyong closing. And also, bato ko na rin dito, si Ray Gaspay asked kung are we losing our moral values? Is this in response or in reaction to the fact that some media personalities became or are propagandists? What causes this moral degradation of values among journalists? So, sorry, it's a complex question, pero baka pwedeng pakidagdag na lang doon sa inyong sagot sa susunod na questions. Go ahead, Regine.
Ako muna, sige. Siguro, sagutin ko muna yung first bit. Whether or not it was expected. I would definitely say, having grown up in the early internet siguro, bilang young millennial, no? Actually, no, because I did not expect it. Because around 10 years ago, remember when the Arab Spring broke out, and then everyone had such an idealistic view of social media that it was actually a tool for helping democracies and allowing people to speak up freely, etc. So I think we were a bit blindsided by how rapidly it actually later helped deteriorate the quality of democracy later on, around 10 years later, no? Or even less than 10 years later, as early as 2016. So that being said, one other thing also that we picked up when I was interviewing academics who have been monitoring pro-Marcos disinformation, for example, was that in the early internet, tama si Christian, nung medyo the market did not look like what it does now, where it's dominated by big tech. When politicians were basically still using fringe websites, their ideas, their narrative did not catch on. It just caught on with social media. Once we became reliant on algorithms na gumagawa ng echo chambers, na nag-amplify ng hate, basically. And then that's how it basically converted more people. So definitely one thing that we have to do is to hold these social media companies accountable. For example, the movement against disinformation, a group of a coalition of fact checkers, lawyers, etc. They wrote open letters to Facebook, TikTok, and I think YouTube. But I think TikTok did not respond to its call for openly labeling disinformation on its platform ahead of the 2022 elections. So there are lots of stuff that we could still be doing to be, I think, raising a ruckus about how these social media companies are not acting enough. No, their algorithms are not keeping up with the new and innovative ways troll farms and public relations agencies are hijacking their system, yung buy and sale ng Facebook pages, Facebook groups. and other things that they're doing, like back in 2020 nung nagkaroon ng influx ng mga clone accounts that suddenly started sending threats to people who had those names. What's our assurance that things like that will not happen again? So I think we need to be engaging with big tech more and demanding more from them as well. So siguro dun sa tanong naman on what we could be doing from GM to restore public trust. Like I mentioned earlier, definitely we need to be working, I guess, with creatives as well. Because it was a PR industry brainchild na that caused the distrust for the free press. I think we also need to be working with creatives to kind of help our image as well. And to work with those who are aligned with our principles, content creators, etc. So that's one thing that we could do, as well as moving to new platforms. May tanong din earlier about I think how some people in the industry are basically sellouts. Siguro one thing definitely is that our newsrooms, yung institution natin, we need to be paying our employees well. We need to be compensating them well. We need to give them backup for the harassment that they are experiencing, for the vulnerabilities they're facing, because the lack of security is what pushes a lot of very young and capable journalists away from the industry and into more comfortable places like PR. So definitely we need more institutional support, palagay ko. Ayon.
All right. Maraming salamat, Regine. That's a lot, ano? Kong, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start with a rejoinder kay Christian. No? Do you remember yung campaign, mga 2016 yun, yung Taking Back Social Media? So maybe we could resurrect that campaign, no, and drive even harder sa messaging doon. If only to separate the trolls from the yung genuine talagang gustong matuto, no, at saka gusto ng legitimate news items. And yung sa relevance and reaching out, no, I think dapat natin i-step up yung media literacy kasi nga because of the dearth of media literacy events, that's why nagka-crop up yung mga question na ba't kailangan pa ng reporters, no? And also this may sound parochial, no, pero I'm talking at a standpoint of a provincial news media practitioner, no. We should engage our communities offline as well as online. No, I can remember yung article ni Ariel noon with when I was still with PCIJ na yun nga wala ngang kuryente in most parts of the country, Wi-Fi pa kaya, no? So I think yung pagbalik natin sa mga communities natin offline as well as online, makakatulong din yon. Also, I guess importante din yung partnership, no? Forging partnerships with the academe, especially. Meron at least pwede nating gawing venue for media literacy and to get more engaging our communities. And also yung may pahabol na question si Julie Alipala, no? How do we get back at these big tech companies? No, maybe we could start trying to or file civil suits against these people, especially when they are not doing what they have assured in their platforms like privacy, data privacy, and making their platforms less toxic. So we go through their processes of reporting, and if they don't respond, then that could be part of the reason why we will be suing them. So that could also be another avenue. So para may pushback talagang ma-feel nila, no? Kasi kahit na big tech company sila, they're still accountable to their customers or clientele, di ba? So, yun lang. Thank you very much, Atong.
Maraming salamat. Thank you so much to our esteemed speakers, Christian, Regine, and Kong. That was a good conversation. Marami pang tanong pero unfortunately wala na tayong oras. Bago po tayo mag-wrap up ng ating program, inanayahan ko lang lahat na kuha raw tayo ng picture. So I think si Shali will give us instructions on how to do that.
Magandang tanghali po. Those who are comfortable po to turn on their cameras, kindly pa-open lang po saglit na ating camera. Okay. Sige po, we have 3 pages po on my screen, no? So hold lang po natin yung smiles. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, smile po. Next po, 1, 2, 3, smile po tayo. Okay. I think 2 pages lang pala. Sige, okay na po. Maraming salamat po, Sir Atom.
Alright. Ngayon naman, bago natin tapusin ang programa, pwede na nating makita yung ginawang artwork ni cartoonist Zach or si Zach, who made an artwork, a live art based on our discussions. So, Zach?
Thank you, Sir Atom. So, ayun, on my live art, I want to be, to include as much elements as much as possible, but I made it like more, a bit minimal, so like to have, to make the live art more, easily understood. So Miss Melinda Quintos de Jesus discussed about the state of the media in the Philippines. So on the media, I use the pen with the wings. So that's the logo. That's in reference to the freedom for media, freedom for all. And then I employed this virus. So like Duterte's hostility towards a critical press, as a virus. So yun yung isa sa mga spikes ng virus, andun yung mukha ni Duterte. So yung tumatak talaga na sinabi na you are free to criticize us. So parang meron siyang subtle, it's like smart censorship. So ayun, nakita yung yung black na placard, yung defend press freedom in reference to the Black Friday protest. So next slide please. So Mr. Jonathan De Santos of NUJP emphasized the attacks that journalists have experienced in the recent years, especially hindi talaga mawala-wala yung libel, saka yung red tagging and killings. He have emphasized that there are 3 killings that happened since the election period. And then next please. And Mr. Christian Isguera from Fox First, emphasize have talk about this fight between truth versus disinformation. I made this. Hindi ko pa siya nakulay, pero nilagyan ko siya ng halo doon sa truth, representing the good, and then the horns on top of the disinformation representing evil. And he also discussed about the proliferation of self-censorship. Yun yung nakakalimit doon sa press freedom. And next slide. And Mr. Pong Corrales from Mindanao Gold Star Daily have discussed about the BBM press con, how it limited their coverage in Mindanao, and also one of the, I think, main weapons used against journalists, the DDoS. So yun yung O sa DDoS, so lagay ko siya ng yung tongue with the teeth. So if you leave out the O from DDoS, so meron siyang subtle na reference sa DDS. And then last is from Miss Eugene Tabato from Washington Post. So you can see that yung sa kamay ni Marcos, yung naka-peace na sign, the troll farms, that he employed, to put this information doon sa nasa right part ng ating live cartoon, which are the Filipinos. So yan, summing up, next slide. So ito yung so I think kukulayan ko pa, I will put put the final outline 2 hours from now. So I hope that nagustuhan ninyo ang live art. So yeah, thank you very much.
Salamat, Zach. Galing. I now turn you over to Carmela.
Hi. We'll have closing remarks from Ariel Sebelino from the Philippine Press Institute.
Thanks, Carmela. Thanks, everyone, for joining this world event. As we celebrate World Press Freedom Day every day, every year, and for the end time, remember those who lost their lives in the line of duty in the defense of press freedom. We all must resist all forms of violence, threat, attack, and intimidation against journalists, if only to protect democratic institutions and spaces, and our hard-earned freedoms as constitutionally guaranteed. We must join ranks and pool efforts to push back and regain control of the ever-increasing nature of technology in the hands of the state and its allies. Mabuhay ang malayang Pilipinong mamahayag.
That ends our program today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will cut the live stream, and then we can say hi to each other when they give us our cue.